Now it's on. Everybody okay? Oh, we got some more people. Yeah. Okay. I'll wait. And it's Titanic week, is correct? It's 100 years. It's 100 years this year. It's 100 years this year. 110, right? 22, 12, yeah. Alex, are we good? All right. Good evening. Welcome to the Explorers Club. I'm Alex Moore. I'm on the Lectures Committee, chaired by Ann Passer. And I'm here to introduce tonight's lecture and the introducer to the speaker, because we do these things at the Explorers Club. This week, I'm told, is Titanic week, in the 110th anniversary of the sinking, the tragedy. And since I am a faithful alum of my alma mater, I will bring my own little piece of Titanic stories. Without the Titanic, we would not have Widener Library at Harvard. Harry Elkins Widener was a graduate, I think 1907, of the college, and he was a book collector. And he was coming back from his book collecting trip to the United States when the Titanic sunk. And supposedly, I'm not sure that this is true, on the way he went back for his books, and that's why he missed the. There's nothing funny about it, really. But you gotta love the passion. Too soon? Yeah, 110 years is too soon. I don't mean to be blasé about it. It's just, And his mother endowed the library to Harvard University and recreated his study in the center, in the heart of the university, in the heart of the library, to which people bring fresh flowers every day. It is the largest private library on the planet, and probably the happiest place I've ever been when I was a student. As I said, I'm here to introduce the introducer, but before that, I would like to give you a message from our sponsors. In fact, the Director of Programming, Kevin Murphy, whom I thank for his work, and that is that Tuesday, April 19th, we will have a special lecture with EC50 honoree John Mack, titled A Walk in the Park, Exploring the Truth of Our Nature. And now, for the introducer, Charles Pellegrino is author of 3 New York Times bestsellers, consultant for James Cameron's Avatar movies, and a forensic and space scientist whose stomping grounds go from space to Herculaneum, which is in Italy, not very far from where I grew up, to the Titanic. Here is Charles.
Stephen is the East and South Asia chair for the Explorers Club and a fellow. and his book Poseidon is about the discovery of a Royal Navy submarine off the coast of China. It was published in 2003 by Hong Kong University Press. And he's done some hugely important work related to the Titanic. 2 blocks from here, one of my mentors, Walter Lord, we used to get together all the time, especially every year for the anniversary of the Titanic sailing beginning. Usually we got together about every month to talk all things Titanic. He had the world's largest collection of correspondence with Titanic survivors. And he wondered about the 6, which is what the film is about. And to the point, we were both drawn to this, wondering what happened to them. There was not a clue as to where they went, where they ended up. It was assumed that they were deported back to China. Walter Lord even had hired at one point a private detective, the same guy who had found Harold Bride's family, and that was a fantastic piece of detective work. But he was unable to come up with a clue, and all of these years we had accepted that they had disappeared into history, and we will never know, that we would never know anything about them again. And now we do, and that's your story. And at this point, over to you and your fantastic adventure.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Alex. Good evening, everyone. Both to the folks that are here in person, thank you for coming out. For the people that are joining us online, good evening. And for my friends in China and Asia who are joining us online, good morning. So before I begin, I just wanted to wax nostalgic for a moment because, you know, we're here in the Valhalla of exploration. And I remember the first time I was in this room, I was probably about 15 years old. And I was with my dad, and we were not members of the club, and I think we saw a lecture about mountain climbing, and neither one of us were mountaineers. We were always divers. And I remember sitting in one of these seats and just thinking, gee, what would you have to do to join a club like this? Like, would I have to go to the moon, or, you know, how would I do that? And so, you know, 30-something years later, to be here and to be speaking again, and not just speaking, but speaking about, you know, work that I've done on Titanic is just quite amazing. I guess the lesson to take from that is that dreams do come true if you work hard enough at them. So I would suggest that all of you dream bigger dreams and dream more of them. So before we get to the presentation, I just wanted to say one other thing, which is, you know, as the East and South Asia chapter chair, I often wonder, you know, people ask me, well, what do I get from becoming a member? Gee, the dues are a little bit high, and, you know, what do I get out of this? And although we spend a lot of time and a lot of resources on this lovely, you know, house that we have here in Manhattan, the real thing that we get from being a member of the Explorers Club is being part of this Explorers Network. And this particular project, the 6, without the help of club members James Cameron, Maria Wilhelm, Captain Don Walsh, and David Kincannon, just to name a few, we just would not have had the same degree of success. We would not have had the same degree of access. It was, you know, really just a network that ignited on our behalf, and we're so grateful. I want to thank those 4 individuals particularly, but it's, you know, really a great group of people to be a part of. And if you're already a member, you know, use your network more. It's you know, view other people in the club as your peer. They will respect that you are equally as crazy as they are. You know, all the cavers think that the divers are crazy. The divers think that the mountain climbers are crazy. We all think that the space people are crazy. But, you know, everybody respects what it takes to get where we're going, that we all understand that single-minded pursuit of the mountaintop, the deep cave, the unnamed shipwreck. So, you know, please make greater use of your network if you're already a member. So what I'd like to do is to show the trailer from our documentary. That's only about a minute, and then we'll get into the presentation. So. stories such as that of the six of them survived, and I really that much information about it.
That is the true version of events. The Titanic, it is a Chinese story. They were kind of shuffled off and hidden, kind of expunged from the records, so on.
Those stories are very well documented for almost every single one of those survivors. But the Chinese are almost uniquely unknown.
He may have been the last one that was saved. That became the inspiration for how Rose was saved.
The last person rescued from the Titanic is Chinese.
Where did they go? What happened to them?
They deserve to tell their story as much as any other survivors do.
其中有一个人好像知道很多关于伤亡这个人的事情。
Yeah, maybe the last person rescued from the Titanic.
Oh my God!
They were there and they lived it. They're out there, we've got to go find them.
All right, so as I start off tonight, I'd like to talk first about the nature of Titanic research today, so Charles and I can have a fist fight about this afterwards. But Titanic research as it currently stands, it is fueled by one of the most hair-splitting, know-it-all, measuring contest communities on the Internet, and for the Internet, that is really saying something. And as such, attempting to venture into a dusty corner of Titanic history that is not well documented really requires one to kind of roll up your sleeves and put on your white cotton gloves and get out your tweezers and really go into whether it's testimony or artifacts or other records and just kind of, pull words out line by line. Could this person have known this? Were they there? It's a very inexact but exacting science. And it is, the layers of testimony and hearsay and popular myth that encrust the history, the genuine history and the facts. It's like barnacles on the history. If you've seen the photos of Titanic with the rusticles all over it, it's just like that. So there's a lot of rusticles that need to be cleared away on the way to the truth. So the best example of this, to sort of set the scene, is Titanic's band. Okay, so here are five of the 8 members. I know somebody's watching online saying, "That's not the whole band." I know, it's just a photo. Couldn't crop it anyway. So the band is probably the one group of people on Titanic towards which there is no enmity. Nobody blames them for anything. Everybody likes the band, and yet no one can agree what was their final song. Was it "Nearer My God to Thee" or was it "Autumn"? Shout out your favorite band title if you disagree. And how long did they play? Did they play right up until the moment that Titanic's hull cracked and it was no longer feasible for them to play, or did they give up 45 minutes earlier? Some people. So no matter what set of facts or stories are put forward, it's always going to be difficult to reach some kind of agreement. So that was the environment into which we waited when my co-creator and longtime friend Arthur Jones and I decided to get involved in this. So how did we get started with this particular bit of Titanic history? So we had done a previous project before called, this is the HMS Poseidon. It was a Royal Navy submarine. It sank off the coast of China in 1931 in an accident. We had the honor of presenting our documentary, The Poseidon Project, here in this room about 7-8 years ago. I wrote a book about it, and we thought, well, that was jolly. We had a good time. We were pleased with the outcome. We felt we did some good work, and it didn't cost us a ton of money. Great, let's do another one. So my first suggestion was a Shanghai shipwreck. Arthur is and has been based in Shanghai. I thought, okay, we'll make it easy for him. I'll commute down from Beijing. We can take the subway out to the various filming sites. It won't cost us a lot of money. That's great. So I suggested this particular shipwreck, and again, it was a great story. Massive loss of life, big mystery to solve, some political intrigue, just, elements that we really loved. So we started to work on this, and the first problem that we encountered was we thought, well, it's kind of a complicated story to tell to an international audience that may or may not know a lot about the Civil War in China in the late 40s. And I thought, no big deal. We'll compare it to Titanic. Big shipwreck, big maritime disaster, no problem. Everybody knows Titanic. We'll do that. So I then turned to my Titanic bookshelf and started to pull some of the classics, including A Night to Remember, off that shelf and started to reread them. The other thing that I did was I started to look online. And I came upon Encyclopedia Titanica, which is exactly what it bills itself to be. It is everything you ever wanted to know about Titanic and more. And then if you want to argue about it, you can go down into the comments and get right into it. Now, I know that in late night Googling, I had seen this page before, Chinese sailors on the Titanic. I remembered it. I remembered that I had filed it away somewhere. But if you were to scroll down on this page, at least when we first kind of came back to it in maybe 2013, 2014, there just wasn't a lot on it. It was almost like a ghost story. It was almost like a UFO sighting, like, Bruce Ismay mentions them in his testimony. A couple of other people said, Chinese passengers, and that was it. And I know that the first time I saw it, it was probably very much like everyone else. Saw it, read it, went, oh, that's interesting, click onto the next page. This time when we were looking at this other shipwreck story, I started to think, but what happened to these men? We have books on the Irish on Titanic. We have books on the Jews on Titanic. There's now a book entitled The Black Man on Titanic. But why don't we know anything about these men? So I started to go back through coverage of the 2012 100th anniversary, and I thought for sure somebody would have put up their hand and said, my grandfather was on Titanic. Absolutely dead silence, crickets, there was nothing out there. And I thought, well, that's not possible. That's not possible that these men just disappeared after they got off. They survived Titanic and then they just disappeared. They never told anyone their story. They never had families. They never went on with their lives. I'm sorry, I don't believe it. Sometimes, the best weather forecast is sticking your head outside the window. And in this case, I thought, no, they're out there and we've got to go find them. So there was only one problem at that moment, and that problem was that I had already convinced my co-creator to work on a separate shipwreck story. So it took about 7 months for me to convince Arthur that we were working on the wrong story. And finally, after prodding him with, A Night to Remember and other books, no, just read this. It's just a shipwreck story. No, just read this. It's fine. Finally, after about 7 months, I said, look, we have to do this story now. Someone else will stumble on this story. They will do it first, and we will kick ourselves in the rear ends 100 times. We've got to do it now. We can always come back to the other story. And so finally he agreed, and we started forward. All right, so when we talk about the Chinese passengers, who are we talking about? Who were they? Why were they on Titanic? So we started with this list, which is from the original passenger manifest, and there are 8 names on it. Okay. Now, this list told us a lot and didn't tell us much at all. Okay. First thing that we saw was, okay, these are all Romanized names, and we don't have any Chinese names for them. Okay, that's a bit of a roadblock, but okay. The other thing that we noticed is that all 8 men had only 2 names, seemingly a surname and a given name. For Chinese men in 1912, turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, that would not have been the norm. And it seemed very strange that all 8 of them only had sort of these 2 these 2 name names or these 2 character names. So we thought that was a bit strange. We also wondered, what dialect is this? In other words, where are these names coming from? Are they coming from some kind of a passport or official document? Are they coming from, did their employer, the Donald Steamship Line, give these names to the White Star Line and say these are our passengers? Did they walk up to the ticket counter at the White Star Line and say, my name is, whatever, and then someone is interpreting what they said and wrote it down? Where did these names come from? Excuse me. At the same time, we were also trying to determine what dialect is this? What dialect would these men have spoken? It's probably not Mandarin in 1912. Cantonese, maybe, maybe a different dialect. So the list was on one hand helpful and on the other hand not very helpful. So we thought, all right, well, we're going to grasp at any straws that we have, and as far as we can pull each thread, we're going to pull it as far as we can. One thing that we noticed almost immediately was that if you look, at that time when we started the research, if you looked online for a typed version of this list, that very first name at the top was listed as Ali Lam. Ali like Muhammad Ali, A-L-I Lam. Okay, but I think because we had been in China for a while and we were, Arthur and I both speak Chinese and we were familiar with local customs, we realized that the first name is not Ali Lam, it's Alam. Now, that was helpful to us because Alam is an appellation, or the is an appellation. In other words, it's like calling someone Little Jimmy. So, there is a surname but it's very uncommon, and we thought, well, it's probably unlikely that this person would have had that surname. So suddenly we're thinking, okay, this is a list of nicknames, crew names, names they use at work. They're probably not official names. Okay, now what do we do? But at least we had taken this first sort of step forward and began to understand what we were dealing with. So then I started to kind of Google around, and I think I put the magic Explorer search terms into YouTube, and those two terms were China and Titanic. And the first thing that popped up was this, a deleted scene from the James Cameron film, from the James Cameron 1997 film. And sure enough, it is what it says at the top, Chinese man rescue. So if at some point I had pulled my 2 DVD deluxe set of Titanic off the shelf and watched the bonus materials, I would have seen this deleted scene much earlier. Of course, I didn't see it until much later. But the scene itself recreates a historically recorded event where a Chinese man was rescued floating on debris. He was rescued by Harold Lowe when he went back on Lifeboat 14 after the ship sank. He was one of only 4 people rescued in Boat 14, and one of the other men died. So we don't know the order they were rescued in. It's possible that Fang Long, this man, was the last person rescued from Titanic, but we just thought, wow, that's amazing. And then as we watched it again, I showed it to Arthur, and we thought, but if James Cameron shot this scene, that means that he knew about this event. Well, what did James Cameron know about the Chinese men on board Titanic? And so one of our key questions became, what did James Cameron know, and when did he know it? And how much more does he know? So, excuse me. So we sort of filed that away. And then we started to look at, all right, where did these men come from? Who were they? Why were they on Titanic? Okay, so this is a map of Guangdong province in southern China. That reddish area is where Hong Kong is. That star in the middle is Guangzhou. That's the provincial capital. So the men were all listed, on the Titanic manifest, all the men were listed as being from Hong Kong. We thought that was unlikely. We thought they were likely from other parts of China. And as our research continued, it's possible that at least one of them was actually from Hong Kong, but it's more likely that they came from another part of China. So if you look at this area, so Macau is over here sort of on the easternmost edge of this map. So, we're sort of in southwestern Guangdong province, including these 2 islands down here. This is known as the Taishan region, or it's probably better known as the Toisan region or the Hoisan region. These were the Toisan people were really the initial settlers of Chinatowns around the world. In the 1850s, actually in 1849, they were some of the first people to come to the United States to prospect for gold in California. Later they stayed and built the railroads. So, the Chinatowns that we know them at present, they were essentially founded by people from Toisan. So there was a struggle for land, there was a famine, there was some ethnic strife with other groups, and this led to young men from Toisan seeking work elsewhere. They were really the first wave of people who left China in search of, some kind of migrant labor opportunity elsewhere. So they would have made their way from here to Hong Kong and then found essentially whatever employment was available at the moment. They later became very popular among British sea captains especially, who said, and I'm paraphrasing, they were less drunk and cost less than their Irish counterparts. And as such, many ships had as much as 50 to 75% of their crew were Chinese, and they were from Toisan at that. So that gave us a picture. It started to give us a picture of, okay, who are these men and where do they come from? Sorry. Okay. So you're going to wonder, why is Daniel Radcliffe on the screen? I started to think of, as our research continued, I started to think of the men as Rosencrantz and Guildenstern on the Titanic. So Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are two minor characters in Shakespeare's Hamlet who pop up at very opportune moments in the story. They are definitely not major characters, but their appearance kind of illuminates parts of the plot that perhaps we otherwise wouldn't have paid quite as much attention to. That's how I started to feel about our Chinese passengers. They started to pop up in the same lifeboat as J. Bruce Ismay. They started to be, perhaps the last person rescued from Titanic. They just started to pop up in these places that illuminated the Titanic story as a whole. And so I started to think of them as Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, and, they both die at the end of the play. But, that didn't happen with all of our men. But for me, it was just a reference. So that's why Daniel Radcliffe is on the screen. All right. So let's talk about where were the men and why were they on Titanic. So they were on Titanic because they were working as professional seamen. They were mariners. And they would normally work as firemen, which doesn't mean that they put out fires. It means that they stoked fires. It means that they worked in engine rooms and they did a lot of dirty, grueling work that other people didn't want to do. At the time that Titanic was coming to New York, there was a coal strike on in the UK, and that prevented a lot of other ships from sailing, including the cargo ships on which they worked. Because they were idle at the time, their employer, the Donald Steamship Company, decided, okay, let's second these men over to our North American operations. They can work on our fruit boats on the North American coast. There's still a little bit of unclarity as to whether they wanted to do that and maybe paid some or all of their passage to the United States. That's still not entirely clear, but there they were on board. Titanic is the only ship sailing at the moment, and so there they go across the North Atlantic. So because they were traveling as unmarried third-class men, they would have been. Let me see if I can get this to work. They would have. They would have been quartered sort of up here in the bow. All right. So F or G deck. They would have been in a single 8-person berth or maybe 2 adjoining 4-person berths. We don't believe that the 8 men knew each other prior to boarding Titanic. Some of them had worked with each other. We know from shipping records that some of them had worked on ships together in the UK. Or elsewhere in Europe prior to boarding Titanic, but they were not like a team. They were not necessarily a work unit unto themselves. They just happened to have the same employer and they had the same destination. All right, so they took a special passenger train from London to Southampton. They boarded and then they found their own accommodations. It must have been very strange for them. They're often incorrectly identified as, first they're incorrectly identified as being stowaways aboard Titanic. We know for a fact that's not the case. We saw their ticket, earlier in this presentation. Also, they are often listed as, because they were professional seamen, they were listed as being members of Titanic's crew. They were not. They were not part of Titanic's crew. They were just mariners who were hitching a ride. It's like airline pilots who deadhead. They happen to be on board the plane, but they're not working. So it must have been a very strange experience for them to be on a ship of this size and also even this level of relative luxury and not have anything to do. They must have been so used to being confined to, the worst parts of a ship, and then here they are, and they have this sort of week-long, almost pleasure cruise to North America. It must have been a very strange experience for them. So let's skip ahead to Titanic and the disaster. So where the men are quartered, okay, so this is a port side view of Titanic. The iceberg strikes the starboard side, the opposite side, sort of right about here-ish, not so far from where they would have been quartered. And especially as men that worked on ships, they would have realized immediately that something was wrong. Okay, where they were that far deep in the bow, that far forward, they clearly would have felt the collision. They clearly would have been alarmed by it. And then especially when Titanic's engines stopped, they would have known, a ship this size just doesn't stop its engines in the middle of nowhere for no reason. They must have realized very quickly that it was, that something was really wrong. Whether they realized it or not, within 20 minutes they would have been at least wet, if not flooded out of their cabin. So very early on in the disaster, and I think this is very important to understanding them and their fate, very early in the disaster, they are aware that something is wrong, and they have no choice but to start moving either up or back or both. Either up towards the boat deck or towards the stern, just somewhere that was essentially not underwater. So probably they made their way. Okay. So continuing from the front, so this is Scotland Road. Okay, for those of you who've seen the movie, remember this. So Scotland Road was a passageway along, it ran the length of the ship, and this would have allowed, it was designed so that both third-class passengers but also crew could move back and forth and sort of not be in the way of second and first-class passengers. So they would have been directed by stewards to move back this way up here to the third-class common room, and then to wait there for other instructions, right? So imagine them moving probably with some or all of their possessions back this way. But again, they're underway very early on. They know something is wrong, and here they are heading towards the stern, probably up, at least at first, to the common room. One thing that we did not find in any of the research is we found no accounts of them being on deck. Oh, I noticed Chinese men on deck waiting for... we found no accounts of that. So it seems like they didn't spend a lot of time standing around waiting for access to a lifeboat. That means they probably were below decks. They were probably with the other third-class passengers in the third-class common room, at least until the latter stages of the sinking. All right. So let's just talk about Titanic's lifeboats for a moment. So these are the forward lifeboats. All right, so this is the first-class staircase, that beautiful staircase that everyone loves to show. This is the first-class staircase here. Okay, this is the wheelhouse here. And then over on this side, Titanic's first lifeboat, or lifeboat number one, was actually what was called a cutter. It was a smaller wooden boat that could be launched if a passenger or crew member fell overboard. It was permanently in a berth so that it could be launched quickly. And then here next to it is collapsible lifeboat C. That's foreshadowing. This is going to become very important in a few moments. But collapsible lifeboat C was one of 4 collapsible boats that Titanic had. Each one collapsed down to about 3 inches tall. So not very tall, but each one of them weighed about 1,000 pounds. So kind of like IKEA furniture. Just, weighs a ton, but packs flat. So, and there's another one on each side. The pattern is mirrored on each side. So this is This is Lifeboat 2 here at the cutter, and then collapsible D on the deck. Up on the wheelhouse, it's not shown on this diagram, but collapsible A and collapsible B were stored on top of the wheelhouse, and so would have had to be sort of pried down and assembled and so forth. Now, when we say collapsible lifeboat, what we mean is something that looks like this. This is collapsible D. So it's a lifeboat that has canvas sides, canvas gunnels. It can be assembled somewhat quickly, probably take about 20 minutes altogether. And then it has oar locks, it has oars, you can row it, and it has almost the same capacity as a wooden lifeboat. Not quite as much, but similar. And these were added because in addition to the 16 lifeboats that the Titanic had and was required to have, they felt, well, let's just throw in a few extra lifeboats just for safety, not that we'll ever need them because the ship is unsinkable, and here's these 4 collapsible boats. So, the most famous occupant of one of those boats was J. Bruce Ismay, the owner of Titanic. So, he illuminates the story of the Chinese men, and the Chinese men illuminate his story. So in the closing phase of Titanic sinking at about 2 o'clock in the morning, most lifeboats are gone. So if you remember that famous painting of Titanic at that wild angle, and if you remember from the Cameron film, everyone's running to the stern for high ground. By this point, almost all of the wooden lifeboats have now left. So it's down to the collapsibles. The crew are assembling collapsible C on the starboard side. They're assembling collapsible D on the port side, and they're starting to get A and B down. But they need C and D to launch first because they need that berth in order to launch both of them. The other thing to remember is that at this point, they are much closer to the water than they would have been if Titanic were upright. So they're now, by the time the collapsible C launches, it's only about 15 feet off the surface. So it's counterintuitive, but the only boats left, if anyone thought I should go towards the water, I should go forward, I should go towards the bow, that was where a measure of salvation was. Going towards the stern at this point, although people probably didn't realize it, was almost certain death. But heading towards the bow, where there were still potential lifeboat seats, that's where salvation was at that moment. So Ismay, who was painted as a coward after the disaster for having survived, Ismay said that he did everything that he could to get as many people as possible, as many women and children as possible, into lifeboats and help those lifeboats get launched. And then at the very end, collapsible C is loaded, and either he saw an opportunity, it's not clear, but either he saw an opportunity and hopped in, or it's possible that a Titanic officer said to him, Mr. Ismay, why don't you get into the boat? And he did. Okay, so he steps in, survives, and dies an almost immediate social death from which he never recovered. Now, when we were doing the research on this, we felt that although there's been a lot of doubt cast upon the honesty of the various people who presented in both the American and the British inquiries, we felt that at least this was bedrock official testimony that had been given under oath, and that was the baseline that we would use for the accounts of Titanic. Okay, we really found nothing that to us said that Ismay didn't do what he said he did. It's a judgment of history whether or not people feel he was a coward. But there was really no evidence not to suggest that he didn't do everything possible to get people onto lifeboats, and at the very last moment he saw his opportunity and he took it. Why is that important for the story of the Chinese men? It's important because, okay, that's the IKEA illustration of the. So if you just to come back to this for a second, if you look at this photo, so this is an Engelhart collapsible lifeboat, just like was on Titanic, and this is in its sort of collapsed state, but it's floating. It has a very buoyant cork hull to it. So the men are standing in the boat, and you can see that, I mean, they're not even up to their ankles. Okay? So the idea that anyone could have stowed away in this boat, which was an accusation leveled at the Chinese survivors, I mean, it's just impossible. If you really believe that, go to IKEA, buy a piece of furniture, try to pack yourself into it, and see if anybody discovers you. I mean, it's just ludicrous. Sorry. We'll come back to that. Okay. Yeah, we'll stay on IKEA for just a moment. So Ismay's story illustrates that, first of all, Collapsible Sea was not full at the time that it launched. And that's critical because even if there were men in that boat, be they third class, second class, or first class, they were not denying seats to any other available passenger. Now, depending on which side of Titanic you were on, if you're on the starboard side, it was women and children first. If you're on the port side, then the rule was women and children only. So, in theory, being on the starboard side, if seats were available, then there was no reason that if, as Ismay said, there were no women and children around, that he and William Carter, the other first-class passenger who was on Collapsible Sea, that they called around, any women, any children, lifeboat. If no one was responding to that call, then there was no reason for more people not to get into that boat. And ultimately, the boat launches just under capacity. It's not empty, but it's certainly not filled to the brim, certainly not for the last lifeboat leaving from the starboard side. Okay, so there were a number of accusations leveled against the Chinese men in the aftermath of the disaster. The implication was always that they took the seats of women and children who could have survived. So one of the accusations was that they had stowed away in the boat. Okay, and some said even before they left Southampton. So imagine yourself tucked in here for 4 or 5 days, going unnoticed, starving, bathroom functions. I mean, it's just ludicrous. Also, because this boat was stored flat on the deck in the position of the number 1 lifeboat, there's just no opportunity to get into it. It is physically not possible. As much as possible and as often as possible, we try to apply scientific fact and scientific reality to the claims that we were assessing. Okay? It's just simply not possible that anyone could have stowed away in the boat either just before its launch or during the voyage. Okay, so that one we threw out, almost immediately. Another accusation that was leveled against the Chinese men was that they dressed as women to gain undue access to the boat. Okay, now, first of all, there is no indication that they ever donned that clothing, that they donned shawls or, where would they have gotten it? When would they have time to pick it up? What would have made them, oh, gee, let's grab some, dresses and try to, it's just, again, it's something that's just totally baseless. So we threw that out as well. But there was one account that gave us some insight into that. And that was the account of a 9-year-old boy named Frankie Goldsmith. So Frank lost his father on board Titanic. Okay, Frank Goldsmith kissed his wife and Frankie goodbye and said, "Don't worry, I'll get the next boat," as quite a number of men did. In his case, he got in the boat and then he, right about, is it? Yeah, okay, that makes it easier. And he said, this was an interview done in 1943. He said, "The lifeboat was cut loose after reaching the surface, and to young Frank, it was a great adventure. He remembers particularly looking toward the rear of the boat and seeing 4 Chinese crouched there. Their long black coats and round caps probably passed them as women in the confusion, he believes. They sat very quiet with their arms folded in flowing sleeves and faces expressionless." So this was kind of a Rosetta Stone moment for us when we found this, because suddenly we thought, where did these accusations come from? If they had any base in fact, where did they come from? But this is the clearest eyewitness testimony of their appearance and their position that anyone gave, and it comes from a 9-year-old boy. So this was another thing that we said, okay, we're just going to throw this out. This is, obviously maybe their dress, gave people that impression, but I think long black coats would have been common enough for the age and on Titanic that, they shouldn't have led anyone to that conclusion. The last accusation that was leveled against them was that they hid in the boat. Okay, they managed to get into the boat, and that they were threatened at gunpoint, that they were ordered out of the boat, and that they wouldn't leave, and that they got underneath either the slats, the seats, or they got in with the women and children so that the Titanic's officers would not shoot them, and the officers decided, forget it, leave them. We don't want to hurt any of the women and children. So this was something that we really felt we needed to put to the test. So again, employing scientific fact where we could, I decided it would be a great idea to build a one-to-one model of a Titanic collapsible boat. And Arthur said to me, "What do you know about building boats?" And I said, "Nothing." But here we are. Thanks to the help of Western Academy of Beijing, which is an international school in Beijing, and thanks to their shop teacher, Mark Trumpold, who just loved the idea, thought it was cool, knew something about bending wood, knew something about boats, and just wanted to take this on. He and about 12 of his students, with some other volunteers from time to time, took about a year to put together a scale model of the collapsible so that we could put this to the test once and for all. The only difference between this collapsible boat and the Engelhart model was A, it didn't have a cork hull, and B, the sides don't actually collapse. I said it was fine for them to do, to make it a fixed-sided boat as long as it had the same dimensions. You can imagine, so we then took a number of high school students who would have been approximately the same size as the Chinese Titanic survivors and put them in the boat in various positions, lying down, trying to hide under the slats, in various places. And it's just not possible that you wouldn't have stepped on them, wouldn't have noticed them, wouldn't have kicked them. The eureka moment in this whole experiment was not when we put them in under the slats. It was when we asked them to crouch down in the front of the boat. So not to sit on one of the seats, but just to sit down on sort of the bottom wooden deck. And then I sat where Ismay would have sat. Okay, so Ismay said, he says in his testimony to the inquiry, he said, at dawn, we saw 4, his words not mine, Chinamen or Filipinos emerge from underneath the seats. Okay, that's one of the few mentions of them in the official testimony. Quartermaster George Rowe also said that he saw the Chinese men, but he said that he saw them come up from within the seats as if they had been crouching. But no one had noticed them. Now, again, this is one of those claims where did they or didn't they? Supposedly there is a commotion at Collapsible Sea during its loading. Maybe there's gunplay, maybe people are firing guns to get them out, maybe they refuse, maybe they hide, among women and children. But then somehow 4 hours later, everyone has forgotten about them to the point where they can be discovered at daybreak. Again, it doesn't make any sense. I think sometimes we find that if a mystery endures for a long period of time, that therefore the answer is necessarily complex. In this case, it was utterly simple. So Mark Trumpold, the teacher, stood back here at the stern where Quartermaster Rowe had stood. I sat over here in an oar position where Ismay claimed that he sat. And when the boat was full and the students were crouching down, we could not see them from where we were. And that was the simple answer. They just couldn't be seen. And we did this on a sunny day in April, very much like today was, outside, afternoon, nice weather, not during the middle of a maritime disaster, not at 2 o'clock in the morning, not in pitch darkness as soon as you were away from Titanic, where the visibility would have been poor. And people are worrying about the loved ones that they may have lost, what they've just gone through. Are they going to survive the night? Is my child going to freeze to death out here in the cold North Atlantic? People are not thinking about, oh, gee, look at those 4 Chinese guys. That people's focus is not on that. Okay, so, but the answer was so simple, and we never imagined that that was going to be the answer. They just couldn't see them. Of course they didn't know they were on the boat because nobody saw them. So, that was such a eureka moment for us. And at the same time, Roe, neither Ismay nor Roe nor Stuart Percy, I think it is, who also left on sea and gave testimony. None of them ever mentioned any kind of commotion during the loading. There are other accounts of it. Yes, that's true. But these are the 3 people who gave official testimony about this, and they had no reason to state that there wasn't. Okay? There is a self-serving account from a gentleman named Hugh Woolner who talks about, I helped to throw foreigners out of the boat, and I assisted Titanic's crew, an act that no Titanic crewman ever verified. So, again, it's the simple answer. The men found an opportunity to get in. They got in. No one told them they shouldn't get in, and they stayed there. And then they just blended in, along with the other 40-something survivors that were in the boat, and then they were noticed in the morning. And then, of course, they became the subject of vilification and started to take the blame for all of the ills that had taken place that night. So one of the other mysteries that we had to face was this man in the water. Who is this man in the water? He was always traditionally assigned the name Fong Long. Now, why he was assigned that name, we didn't know. Why the men that were in Collapsible Sea were given the names Alam and so forth, we didn't know that either. Okay, the Carpathia's deck crew were not standing there with a clipboard as people came in from the lifeboat saying, your name, and what lifeboat number is this? That didn't happen. All of those lifeboat names and rosters were assembled later. So we managed to find this man named Tom Fong. So it just so happens that he shares a last name with this survivor, Fong Long, who was plucked from the water. Okay, so that event is very well documented. Harold Lowe went back, 5th Officer Harold Lowe went back with his boat, waited for everyone, waited for the cries to die down, essentially, so that the other people in his boat didn't feel that it would be swamped. Went back to look for survivors, only found 4 alive, 1 dies shortly afterwards. What we wanted to know was, what were the circumstances of that rescue? How long could have Fong Long survived in the water, under those conditions? So he always said that he was found floating on wreckage. He was found floating on a door. He was found floating on a piece of wood, something like that. One version of the story within Tom's family said that he had floated on top of a corpse at first and then had moved on to, then found this piece of wreckage. So we wanted to know, what had happened, how long could he have been in the water, and also does that affect what time Harold Lowe went back to rescue him. So this is the potential piece of wood it's on display at the Maritime Museum of the Atlantic in Nova Scotia. It might have been the piece of wood that Fong Long survived on. It may also be it's certainly the inspiration for the Jack and Rose piece of wood that may or may not have supported both of them, but Rose never gave it a shot. Okay. The Fong Long story, though, as demonstrated in the deleted scene, did inspire the Jack and Rose ending. Okay? A lot of people have said to me, since we started to show the documentary, why do you think James Cameron, cut that scene out? That's really not cool that he cut the Chinese man. It's just repetitive. It's a long movie. It takes exactly as long to watch the movie as it took for Titanic to sink. Every second is precious, and he decided, well, it's too repetitive. This is the grand finale. I'm going to stick with this one. So it was much simpler in that way. But we really wanted to know, how long could Fong Long have been in the water, and been functional before, time in freezing water, before he would not have been able to struggle up onto the wood to do, as he said, to lash himself to it with a belt. So I volunteered to do a cold water test at the University of Portsmouth in England. This is me at the end of it. Okay, you can't see me shivering in this still photo, but I also have I have a thermometer measuring my deep body temperature, and you can imagine where that might be. So, but it was a 35-minute immersion at 12 degree, 48 degree-ish, 50-ish degree-ish water. I did shiver. My body temperature went down 2 degrees, and the researchers said, there's no way we're taking you down to freezing water. That's unethical, and we're not going to do that. But what they did determine was that for anyone who would have been in water that long, in order to remain functional, in other words, to retain especially manual motor function, to be able to continue to swim, to have, mental cognition that would still allow you to make, reasonable and rational decisions, he would have had to be at least get his body out of the water within 15 to 20 minutes. So that's quite a short period of time. Now, Charles and I were talking before this about the story of the baker, Charles Jaugen, who claimed that he, fortified himself with a good swig of booze before he went into the water, and he floated for 2 hours and just kind of hung on to collapsible sea that was, floating off the wreckage. And after being in the water, I would say no, it probably didn't happen like that. It's possible. It's not 100% impossible, but it's probably not likely. And I will volunteer to do the freezing water test if anybody wants to bring the instruments and the safety crew that's going to stand by. But I would imagine he couldn't have lasted that long. But it shows that Fong Long, who we know could swim, went into the water and actually got on his piece of wood quite quickly. Oops. All right. So when Fong Long went into the water, one thing that we always wondered was, did these men really know each other before? Was there any evidence of that? And I said earlier that they were not a unit, but it does seem that 3 of them had a plan to go to the United States at some point. In an article that we found later on, there was an interview. So after the Titanic sinking, there was an interview in a Cleveland newspaper with a woman named Sue Oy. And this just popped up. One of our genealogists, at one point we had a research team of 16 people because we realized we just needed more firepower. We needed more local expertise. We needed genealogical knowledge. There was just a lot more than we needed that Arthur and I couldn't provide. So one of our genealogists, Grant Dinn, came up with this article, and it said that Sue Oy was a new widow in Cleveland, and she was weeping for her beloved who had died on Titanic. And his name was Assam Len. Assam Len, okay? And that he had said she was waiting in Cleveland for his arrival, and he was going to arrive with his 2 friends, Sam Fong Long and Li Ling, and that they were going to get married, and that these 3 men were going to establish themselves as merchants in Cleveland. Well, of the 2 men, out of the 8 Chinese passengers, the 2 men that didn't survive are Li Ling and Len Lam, which almost match up to the names that are in this article. Now, this is there were a lot of crazy articles that were published after Titanic, just scurrilous rumors and, all kinds of things that were just pure fabrications. But this story matched our men's journey so closely, and also there's no reason for Sue Oy to just make up the story and give this interview. There is no upside for her. In fact, she closes the article by saying, all I want now is to die. So this is not somebody who's seeking publicity. She's just a bereaved, not even widow. She didn't even have the chance to get married. And suddenly that led us to think, well, that makes sense. These 2 men died. Fong Long ends up in the water, so they stayed together until the end, and only Fong Long survived. Suddenly, that made a lot of sense to us. So, of the 2 that didn't survive, so we named the project the 6 because we wanted to focus on the survivors. There wasn't really enough material about the other 2 to do anything substantial. But there is one mystery that remains. Okay, So this is the Titanic Cemetery in Nova Scotia. These are the numbered graves. Some of them now have names. In fact, most of them now have names. But one of them, I think it's body 223. There are two lists that describe each body and the effects that it had, any personal effects, any tattoos, so forth. One of them describes the body as dark, parentheses, like Greek, or probably Greek. The other list says very dark, parentheses, like Japanese. Now, it's possible, although not necessarily likely, but it's possible that the body of either Li Ling or Len Lam was recovered and brought back. Now, there are third-class bodies in this cemetery, and some of them are still unidentified. But it's possible. This is the kind of thing that a DNA test could easily tell us. We don't need to know which one it is. I'm not sure that we'll ever know that. But at least if we could test for, the ethnicity of the person, we would know right away whether this is one of our missing casualties, and even potentially put a name on, one of Titanic's last unidentified victims, at least as far as the cemetery is concerned. Okay, so what does all of this tell us about Titanic? Why look at their story? Why talk about them? Okay, it illuminates Ismay and the veracity of his testimony. It removes the stain that has been on the men that were on Collapsible Sea for over 100 years. That they were cowards, that they snuck onto the boat, that in that way they were unique among Titanic's survivors, among third-class male survivors, where they were vilified, and all the ills around Titanic were sort of ascribed to them in absentia, because nobody ever bothered to try to find them or interview them. The reality is that even though on the night there were definitely men who, out of chivalry, in an act of gallantry, kissed their families goodbye, stepped back from the rail, and accepted their fate. Yes, that happened. But just because someone survived, just because a male passenger survived, does not mean that the opposite is true. It doesn't make them a coward. Just because someone wants to survive, Ismay wanted to survive, Carter wanted to survive, these men wanted to survive, and they had their opportunity and they took it. And so did a lot of other first-class men, second-class men, and third-class men. Okay? They had their opportunity and they survived. Does it make them heroes? No, but it doesn't make them villains, and it doesn't make them cowards. And it doesn't mean that we should continue to see them in the same way that they would have been seen in 1912 and vilified in 1912. So finally we're able to remove that stain from them after all this time. It also gives us a little more insight to the experience and the evacuation of third-class passengers. Okay, the one survivor I didn't mention, Chong Fu, we believe he gets off in Lifeboat 13, which leaves at 1:45. Traditionally, that Asian passenger has been believed to be Masabumi Hosono, the single Japanese second-class passenger. But Hosono would have had an opportunity to get on a boat much earlier. It makes much less sense for Chong Fu to get off on 10 than it does on 13. If he gets off on 13, it means that the Chinese men don't even get to appear on deck, on the boat deck, until about 1:45. And by that point, their opportunities to escape are already diminished. Probably they left the stern common room, took the second-class staircase up. There's boat 13. Chong Fu has an opportunity and gets in. Okay, so this shows us that it allows us to follow the movements of third-class men. It allows us to see what were their opportunities for survival. And I'm not talking about gates, locked gates, unlocked gates, stewards keeping people back. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm just talking about the simple opportunity to get up on deck. Okay. And from Fan Long's time in the water, we know that cold water just would have limited, the opportunities for anyone in the water to have survived such a long time. That, that Howard Lowe was able to rescue even 4 people was in itself somewhat miraculous. So, speaking of running out of time, I'm going to stop there so that we can answer some questions. But I thank you all very much for your attention.
That was riveting. Charles?
Yes.
Hi. There were supposed to be 3 chairs here, but we can just drag a couple. And then you all can, if you don't mind. There you go. If you'd like. Or, you know, you can pass it between you two. Thank you. Thank you, Martin. I'm not going to sit. I'm preparing a chair for our president who may pop in and has a connection to the Titanic, and we're scoot over. But perhaps we can take a couple questions from the audience, and then you all can start chatting. Yeah.
It's for the online audience, so they can hear you nice and clear.
Just a question. At what point did you start, filming the documentary and realize there was something here for the documentary? Just curious, how early in the process that happens.
Sure. So this time around, Arthur and I sort of worked in concert. So what I want out of a project like this is to write a book. What he wants out of something like this is to make a documentary. So we started filming fairly early on. Arthur's story was much more about the process. How do you find something like this? Where do your crazy ideas come from? When do you get frustrated? When, what are those reactions? What are the eureka moments? And capturing all of those. I think we probably shot our first footage in September, it's 2014 or 2015. We went to meet Tom Fong Lung's son, and to kind of see what his story was, try to suss out whether he was for real or not. See some of the items that he had. So we started very early on, and just sort of shooting with a DSLR, and then but as much as possible we recorded along the way, because it's awful in a document. Don't fool yourselves. There's lots of reenactment in documentaries, whether it's labeled as such or not. But in this case, I mean, for example, in this case, I was actually kept away from some of our researchers because Arthur wanted to be able to capture me getting news from them for the first time. So it was a really weird way of managing people, of saying, "Hey, can you look up?" And then 3 weeks later, I still don't know the answer. So yeah. So early on, yeah.
I'm just interested in the whole topic of cowardice. Cowardice. That's all. I just.
So the question was
interested in cowardice.
Was the subject of cowardice. I mean, the way that the Titanic story was presented in 1912 was, it's a really weird fine line. I'm sure Charles has some thoughts on this as well. So if you stepped back from the Titanic's rail and said, "Goodbye, my love, I'll get the next boat, don't worry about me," and then 20 seconds later you jumped into the water and swam to that boat, you were fine. If you got into the boat or attempted to get into the boat with your loved ones, you were a coward. You should have given up your seat to women and children that were not standing there to take the seat. So, I mean, it's a very weird kind of Edwardian lens with which to view these acts. And then, but of course, as your status on board, I don't want to say declined, but, if you were first-class passenger and you kind of swam to a boat, that was okay. If you were a third-class passenger, then you were a dirty so-and-so, who probably ate the child that, you should have saved in the first. It's ludicrous. If you go back and read the accounts from the time, it's absolutely ludicrous, some of the things that, I mean, even Harold Lowe, who is, in my mind, one of the heroes of Titanic, even Harold Lowe had to apologize to the Italian consulate for constantly saying that he was fighting back Italians trying to get into, and he always used the word Italian. He didn't say foreigner. He said, I had to fight back these Italians, and these Italians were trying to rush the boat, and, the Italians this, the Italians that. And finally the Italian consul said, Sorry, but that's really offensive. This is 1912. That's really offensive because and he apologized. He apologized at the inquiry. So.
Yeah. You had Hugh Woolner, who's one of the ones who actually swam for one of the lifeboats on Ismay. His friend Edith Russell said that he had saved many, and she didn't really blame him for getting on a lifeboat in the end. And you have conflicting views of what was going on at that last davit where Ismay got into the lifeboat. Ismay said people couldn't have been gathered more calmly as if at a church. And yet you had Jack Thayer who said there was utter pandemonium. He could see Ismay's head. He could see Ismay get into the lifeboat, and that there had been a warning shot fired practically right near Ismay's head. And 17-year-old Jack Thayer, who was later picked up out of the water, said he would have gone for that lifeboat himself, except there were too many people in between and there was too much pandemonium. I kind of get the impression from all the different and conflicting accounts that Ismay tried to go along with the company line that there was calm and that there was no panic at the end and that there was not any gunfire or terrible things happening on the deck at those last lifeboats, and actually sacrificed his reputation rather than say what Thayer and others saw.
There was a question from online, one sec, that asked whether you could do a genealogy of the victims of the Chinese survivors, and whether, so both, and whether that had been done at all, or if there was any DNA done, or.
So we cursed ourselves, or let me be clear, I cursed us early on by giving the project the working title of The Six, which basically condemned us to attempting to tell 6 complete survivor stories. I think if we went back and did it again today, we would call it The One, or a couple of guys, or something like that. That would not have been nearly as constraining. But with Tom Fong, we got lucky. We got lucky not just because we were able to find him using the methods that we used, hint, email, but also that he was very willing to help us. He was very willing to tell us his story. He didn't know a lot, or he didn't believe he knew a lot, and just shared what he had. There were a couple of other situations where we were contacted by people, or we got in touch with people, and they're like, well, my aunt said her father, and But the biggest problem with those stories, in one case, we had a family that contacted us and then didn't want to talk to us, so that ended up kind of being a dead end. We had another situation where we were fairly interested in what this particular family had to say, but they clearly didn't believe it. And it's very hard, then you're almost like trying to prove a negative to yourself. You're trying to convince them that their family story, So in terms of DNA, I don't know if we ever asked Tom to do any DNA. I think he might have, but yeah, I mean, we had a very long conversation about trying to get permission to do a DNA test in the Titanic Cemetery. It was definitely going to be an expensive process. The biggest problem is that so that's a very big cemetery. It always looks like it's just the Titanic graves. It's not. It's a very big active cemetery, and actually has members of the local Toisan community there, which was amazing when we walked in and saw all these gravestones, like in Chinese and, ancestors from Toisan and so forth. But it's a very big and active cemetery, and other families who have relatives buried there are tired of Titanic folks tramping into their, loved ones' final resting place and, doing core sampling and other stuff. They just feel it's kind of, so they've been very resistant to that of late. So,
just one question. on the passenger list that you showed with the Chinese gentleman, the top name was either Bill or Bert Ford. Do we know anything about him?
So we've looked at that and tried to spell it every different way. You know, what's that second letter? That person's name does not appear on the passenger list, and we don't know why. We don't know what his relationship. We don't know why he's on the same ticket. We don't know anything about him. Yeah, so he is an enduring Titanic mystery.
A slightly geeky, morbid question. So what was the air temperature that night? Do you know?
Well, we know the water temperature was 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The air temperature would have been just a little bit warmer.
So
just about freezing.
If you were wet and you got out, was that really helping you?
Yeah, because water will soak the heat out of your body much faster than air, even if the air is very cold.
Right.
So if you get the upper part of your body out of the water, you'll survive much longer.
Suffer much longer, yeah.
True. Water takes heat 25 times faster out of you. Not good. There are no other questions online, right? Okay.
So the story a bit is about a rehabilitation of these guys from what people were saying about them. What was over time, was there a Weibo, Weishin, like a netizen reaction to this rehabilitation? Because I guess I could kind of imagine that negative story would not be received well in China, and so this kind of rehabilitative story would. I'm really kind of curious how that was consumed.
Right. So that's a good question. So when we started out, we had no agenda. Even though Arthur and I have been based in China for like 25 years, and consider it home, or at least a second home. We did not set out to, as one of the Titanic experts we contacted said, to sugarcoat it, to make it nice for a Chinese audience. That we had no such agenda. We just wanted to explore the history of these men and what happened to them on board Titanic, and where did they go afterwards. The documentary and the book go into far greater detail about that. Because it's Titanic Week, I wanted to focus on the Titanic story tonight. But overall, there was not an awareness in China that Chinese passengers had not been on board Titanic, which I think got us into it in the first place. And then there was a moment where we had cut a trailer to kind of, put the word out and try to raise some money for the documentary and so forth. And it got picked up by a local video platform, and overnight it got 22 million views. So the phone kind of started to ring after that. But the reaction was, gee, we were so mistreated back then, and, thank you guys for doing this, and we still don't understand why you two decided to do the story, but thanks for doing it. And it was the film was not a commercial success in China, but it was certainly a critical success. It was very warmly received, and people coming up and thanking us, and so it's it just kind of turned out the way it turned out. The facts spoke for themselves, and the answers were simple but hidden.
Yes, there was also, this is, if you could find out in any way what they went through on the Carpathia. I think the clue we have is from the Japanese passenger, Hosono, who was bullied so severely aboard the Carpathia that he spent most of the voyage sleeping outdoors in the cold and the rain on a bench on the way to New York from the site of the Titanic sinking. And these men had to have gone through very much the same thing, and it may be another reason. If they went through what he went through at all, they wouldn't have talked about it.
Was there one more question, or did I just dream an arm going up there?
I
Oh, there you go. Thought so.
Thank you. I think I'm curious about how so many of them made it to the lifeboats. Do you have any hypotheses on how they knew to go to the stern? You had mentioned that because they're seamen, potentially, they knew to go to the safety boats in the back. The lounge, it looks like, was also in the back. Is there any leading hypothesis?
Sure. So we worked through this a little bit in the film. So we worked with for you Titanic geeks, the Titanic Honor and Glory, the guys who did the virtual reality model of Titanic, which is just absolutely stultifying. I mean, absolutely unbelievable. And that walkthrough, it's, Arthur is so tired of hearing me use the phrase, the map is not the territory, but it is so absolutely true. Things we found out in 2 hours in a WeWork conference room with these guys. For example, when they came out of, we always thought, well, gee, maybe they walked all the way to the stern from their cabins on F or G deck. Well, no, they couldn't have, because the watertight doors would have dropped and there would have been no choice but to go up the staircase. But you don't know that unless you're standing there. If you're looking at the blueprints, you can't automatically see that. We think that they probably would have followed the instructions because they were sensible. Go that way up and away from the water. Okay, makes sense. Probably at some point, either early on, but more likely later on, they sort of backtracked and realized that staircase, the second-class staircase, which was also near where they would have boarded Titanic, would take them up, and that salvation was up. So David Gleeker, I think he pronounces his name. He's a former Adelphi University statistics professor. He wrote a book called, I think it's called The Revisionist History of the Third-Class Passengers on Titanic. But he went through and posited 20 different ways that third-class passengers could have made it to the boat deck. So we think probably they came out up the second-class staircase, because then when you come out, there are the aft lifeboats. There's Lifeboat 13. Bam, Chung-Fu's in, and then the other lifeboats are basically gone. So they can kind of look up and see there's nothing on the stern. Maybe from their vantage point they could see that there was some activity, down near the water line, the collapsibles coming together. But definitely the fact that they were on the move early, I think, helped them. They weren't complacent. They had no choice but to get going. And I think also they just their knowledge of ships in general probably helped them a lot.
Okay, we are, I think, out of time. Oh, Martin, you want to have the last word?
All right.
Oh.
Sure. Why Chung-Fu? Why did he get in that boat, and what happened to him? First of all, we don't know that it was the man named Chung-Fu. We just don't know that. Again, people and their stories were not necessarily matched up later on, because almost no accounts were left behind. I don't know. Again, because these men were not necessarily a unit, they maybe he was straggling, or maybe he came out first and heard somebody call. I don't really know. But there was an opportunity for two men. If you really get into the testimony, you can see where he and another person got in, and they survived. And yeah, I mean, he saw his chance and he took it.
When can we see the documentary, and when is the book going to come out?
Let me finish the previous question. The Chung-Fu, if it was indeed Chung-Fu, he was somebody for whom there were just too many people with that name, and we kind of got lost in the records. There was a great story about a man who ended up in the UK and married a white woman, and there was murder and suicide and opium smuggling and so forth, and he turned out to be too young. He was the wrong age, and we're like, why can't? So the documentary has been out, kind of. It got a full cinema run in China a year ago. This time, it's been in, I think, 13 festivals now, both online and offline. We're still waiting for some kind of distribution within the United States. So if you're ever going to ask Netflix to put it on, now would be a good time, or your local PBS affiliate, WNET. We're hoping there'll be more showings. We don't have anything scheduled right at the moment. The book just came out in Chinese like this week. So if you read Chinese, you're in luck. For the English version, it'll probably be a little while longer. It's still looking for a proper publishing home.
Okay. Well, let's thank our speaker.
I have one question for you. I guess. One more question?
Okay. We are out of time.
Okay.
But thank you so much. Do you have it? No, I'm sorry. I don't have it, Alex.
Yes. Are they planning on having anything for the Chinese passengers,
They're thinking
survivors, and the lost?
But first they want to make sure that they finish it first because they're out of money. They actually approached us and asked us if they wanted us to fund the whole thing. First they said it couldn't possibly cost that much, and then we said, well, do you want us to fund the whole thing?
So we generally have a certificate that hasn't been printed, but I'm happy to